In the heart of a merciless blizzard, Birmingham, Mafid and Azizern, where the world was swallowed by white chaos, Clara Monroe stumbled through the snow, her heart as heavy as her soaked coat, each step a battle against the storm and her own grief. A stranger to the mountain, she was a widow lost in more ways than one, her trembling hands clutching a soggy handbag, her eyes searching for a flicker of hope. Then a faint light pierced the darkness. A cabin, and within it, Thomas Rayburn, a man who'd long chosen silence over company. What began as a desperate knock on a stranger's door would unravel into a quiet, profound connection, proving that even in the coldest storms, two broken souls can find warmth in each other's scars. The wind howled through the mountains, a fierce cry that carried the weight of an ancient warning. Snow had been falling since the first light of dawn, soft and steady at first, but by nightfall it had transformed into a relentless beast, thick and unforgiving. It was the kind of storm that made even the hardiest mountain folk pause, double-checking their shutters and huddling closer to their fires. Somewhere in the distance, power lines gave way with a faint crack, swallowed by the chaos of a sky that churned with endless white, erasing trees, roads, and any sense of the world beyond. Tucked into a rugged ridge, a weathered log cabin stood resolute, its timbers worn but unyielding. Inside, Thomas Rayburn sat near a flickering wood stove, the only source of light and warmth in the small room. At 70, he was a man of few words, his life as spare as the cabin itself. His flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hung loosely on his lean frame, and his boots, scarred by countless winters, rested firmly on the floorboards. The storm battered the world outside, but within these walls, time seemed to pause, just the soft crackle of burning logs and the measured rhythm of his breath. Thomas preferred it this way: quiet, solitary, a life pared down to essentials. He was sharpening a knife he hadn't used in years, more out of habit than necessity, when a faint sound broke the stillness. Tap, then again, tap, tap, tap. Hesitant, deliberate, not the storm's doing. He set the blade down, his joints creaking as he rose. He reached for his coat, but stopped by the window, wiping away the frost with a calloused hand. The world was a blur of white, but then a figure, small, hunched, struggling to stand against the wind's assault. Another tap, this time paired with a frail voice. "Hello?" Thomas opened the door slowly, and the cold rushed in like an uninvited guest, scattering snow across the floor. The woman on his porch looked as though the storm had tried to claim her. Her coat was soaked through, her scarf frozen stiff against her face, her hair matted with ice. Her hands trembled violently, clutching a sodden handbag to her chest like a lifeline. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I didn't know where else to go." Thomas stood motionless for a moment, his eyes taking her in. Late 60s, he guessed. Her face etched with lines that spoke more of sorrow than age, her eyes wide with a mix of shame and desperation. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice low but steady. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold, her legs buckling slightly as she entered the warmth. He shut the door, sealing out the storm's fury. For the first time in months, the cabin held the sound of another's breath. Thomas guided her to the chair nearest the stove, and she sank into it, her shoulders slumping like a sail with no wind. Silence settled between them, broken only by the fire's soft pops and the faint hiss of a kettle on the stove. He knelt, unzipping her boots, which were heavy with water, and she winced but didn't protest. Her socks were thin, the kind sold at gas stations in cheap plastic packs, clinging damply to her feet. He fetched a dry towel, wrapping it gently around her feet before setting her boots by the hearth to dry. She watched him, her lips quivering, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered. "You didn't," he replied, his gaze fixed on the task. She tried to tempo, but it faltered like a spark that couldn't catch. "I was driving down Route 12, she said, her voice fragile. "The storm came so fast. I hit something, ice maybe, and lost control. My car ended up in a ditch near a fork in the road. I tried walking back toward town, but the snow—" Her voice broke and she looked away. "It just kept coming." Thomas handed her a mug of water, and she drank greedily as if she hadn't dared to ask for it. "I'm Clara," she said finally. "Clara Monroe." He nodded once. Thomas. Her eyes wandered the room, small, spare, with a worn table, two chairs, and a single shelf holding coffee tins and canned beans. A quilt lay neatly folded on the couch. No television or clocks in sight, as if the cabin existed outside of time. I didn't think anyone lived out here anymore, she said softly. Most don't, he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. She sipped the water, studying him. His eyes were tired but steady, his hands rough from years of labor, his movements precise like a man who measured every gesture. He took a pan from the shelf, pouring soup from a dented can. The scent of chicken and barley filled the air, simple but comforting. He set a bowl in front of her, and she blinked back tears. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas said nothing, taking the other chair, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the fire as if it held answers he didn't expect to find. In the quiet, Clara let out a long breath, the kind that carried months, maybe years of unspoken weight. The storm pressed against the windows, relentless, but the cabin held its own, a small fortress of warmth and stillness. Clara's hands, steadier now, cradled the soup bowl. Color crept back into her cheeks, and her breathing slowed. Her eyes drifted to a shelf above the mantel, landing on a dusty wooden frame. The photograph inside showed a young man in a military uniform, standing beside a truck, one hand on the hood, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. Army? She asked gently. Thomas's gaze remained on the fire, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. After a long pause, he nodded once. A long time ago, he said, his voice low. Clara looked back at the photo. The face was younger, but the eyes were unmistakable, carrying the same quiet weight, the same guarded distance. My husband served too, she said softly. Navy. He passed last spring. Thomas's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the fire. He was the strong one, she continued, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I was always fussing, socks, lunches, schedules. He'd laugh and say, Clara, the world won't end if I forget my keys. She paused, her smile bittersweet. He forgot them a lot. Thomas's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't quite form. He leaned forward, stirring the fire with an iron rod. How long were you married? She asked. 41 years, she said. Not all of them smooth, but they were ours. Thomas nodded slowly, his hand lingering near the flame before pulling back. That's a long time, he said quietly. Clara studied him, her eyes searching. Did you have someone? No, he said, his voice soft but final. Not for a long time. The silence that followed felt different, less heavy, more like a shared understanding. The wind outside screamed, but the cabin remained a haven, untouched. Two people, shaped by time and loss, sat warming their hands by the same fire. Their presence a quiet bridge over years of solitude. By midnight, Clara had drifted to sleep on the couch, wrapped in the cabin's thick quilt, her breathing steady and calm. Thomas, however, remained awake, seated in the wooden chair by the fire, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the glowing embers. He hadn't had a visitor in years, not since the funeral of the last man from his old unit. After that, silence had become his companion, predictable and safe. Loneliness, he'd learned, asked nothing of him. But Clara was different. She wasn't an intrusion. She was a memory, stirring something he'd buried deep, something he wasn't sure he wanted to face. A sharp, dry cough broke the quiet, pulling him from his thoughts. He stood quickly, crossing to the couch. Clara's forehead was warm, not feverish, but her lips looked pale. He fetched a kettle of water, his movements swift but careful, as the storm continued its restless assault outside. Thomas Rayburn stood at the stove in his log cabin, the faint whistle of a kettle breaking the morning's stillness. He plucked a few dried peppermint leaves from a jar, remnants of last summer's harvest, and dropped them into the steaming water. The scent curled upward, sharp and clean, as he poured the tea into a chipped ceramic mug. Clara Monroe stirred on the couch, her movement sluggish, her face pale from the blizzard she'd barely survived. Drink this, Thomas said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. She blinked up at him, her fingers wrapping around the mug's warmth. Still playing medic, huh? She murmured, her voice hoarse but carrying a faint spark of humor. He paused, his broad shoulders stiffening. Used to be, he replied, his words clipped, like a door he wasn't ready to open. Clara's gaze drifted to a corner of the room where a metal trunk sat half hidden behind a stack of firewood. Its surface was scuffed, the kind of box that carried a soldier's life when the war was done. "That yours?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Thomas followed her eyes, his jaw tightening for a moment before he stepped toward it. He hesitated, his calloused fingers lingering on the latch, then opened it with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside lay a neatly folded pair of fatigue pants, a dented canteen, and a faded photograph of 5 young men standing in front of a helicopter, their faces bright with youth and defiance. Beneath it all, a small stack of medals gleamed faintly in the firelight. Clara's expression softened, her eyes tracing the contents with care. "You never talk about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head, his gray eyes distant. "No one really asks." She reached into the trunk, her movements slow, almost reverent, and lifted a small square case. Inside was a purple heart, its ribbon frayed at the edges, the purple fabric worn but proud. "Hero stuff," she said softly, her fingers brushing the metal surface. Thomas shook his head again, more firmly this time. "That's just paperwork," he muttered, his voice rough with dismissal. Clara held the medal carefully, her eyes meeting his. "No," she said, her tone steady. "That's surviving what others didn't." A heavy silence settled between them, thicker than the snow piling up outside. Clara leaned back on the couch, the metal case still cradled in her hands. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "My husband had one too," she said. "Kept it in a drawer like it was nothing. Said the real award was coming home." Thomas didn't respond, but something flickered in his eyes. A rusted gate creaking open just enough to let a sliver of light through. Clara coughed, a dry rattle in her chest, and Thomas moved quickly, fetching another blanket from a nearby chair. He draped it over her shoulders, his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold but from something deeper, something softer that he hadn't touched in years. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen the weight he carried and hadn't turned away. For Clara, the warmth of the cabin wasn't just the fire's glow, it was the quiet kindness of a man who'd chosen to help her mend. The storm eased before dawn, leaving the world outside transformed. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking into fresh snow that blanketed the railings, the trees and the old pickup truck rusting beside the cabin. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting his lungs, the kind of cold that snapped a man awake. He glanced down the hill toward the road, where soft drifts buried any trace of tire tracks. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the faint creak of branches under the snow's weight. Inside, Clara was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. Her cheeks had regained some color, and she wore one of Thomas's old flannel shirts, the sleeves too long, the shoulders too wide, but it made her look steadier, warmer. "I found the coffee," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hope you don't mind." Thomas shook his head. "Not at all." Her smile widened, creasing her face in a way that felt real, not just polite. "It's strong," she added. "That's how it's supposed to be," he replied, the faintest hint of warmth in his voice. They sat across from each other as pale morning light filtered through the frosted windows. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt full, like a shared secret. Clara traced the rim of her mug with a fingertip, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said slowly, "for months I've been waking up in a house that doesn't feel like him anymore. Just clocks ticking, radiators humming, empty sounds." Thomas looked up, his eyes steady. "He used to whistle," she went on, her voice catching slightly. "All the time, different tunes every day. The quiet used to feel peaceful. Now it's just cold." Thomas nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, as if he understood more than he could put into words. "My husband used to say the world's still kind if you look hard enough," Clara added, her gaze drifting to the window. Thomas followed her eyes, then looked back at her. "Maybe he was right," he said quietly. Her smile returned, smaller but steadier, like a candle that wouldn't flicker out. Outside, the snow sparkled under a weak sun, and inside, the warmth lingered long after the fire had settled into embers. By late morning, the clouds had parted, revealing slivers of blue sky between the trees. Clara stood by the cabin door, bundled in her coat again, staring down at the winding road below. I should head back today, she said, her voice soft but resolute, if the road's clear. Thomas stepped onto the porch, squinting toward the horizon where the main road should be. Plow won't get this far until tomorrow, he said. Maybe longer. Clara sighed, her breath clouding in the cold air. Of course, he glanced at her. Your car still down the hill? She nodded. In a ditch. Battery's probably dead by now. Thomas grabbed his keys and headed to the tool shed out back, his boots crunching through the snow. Clara watched from the porch, silent, listening to the clank of tools and the groan of the shed door. 10 minutes later, he returned, wiping his hands on a rag. Axle's cracked, he said. Even if we pull it out, it's not going anywhere. Clara didn't argue. She just pulled her coat tighter, her eyes distant. After a long pause, she spoke again. I think I was meant to find this place, she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas raised an eyebrow and she hesitated, searching for the right words. I've been angry for so long at the world, at him, at myself. Yesterday, walking through that storm, I thought I might not make it. And I didn't care, but I knocked and someone answered. Thomas didn't reply immediately. He looked at her, not past her, but into her, as if he could see the weight of her words, the years of grief packed into them. Maybe, he said finally, the road brought us both somewhere we needed to be. Clara let out a soft laugh, almost a huff, through her nose. You always talk like that? She asked, a flicker of playfulness in her tone. No, he said, his voice steady. Just when it matters. 2 weeks later, the snow had melted from the porch steps, and patches of earth poked through the white along the tree line. Birds had returned to the hills. Not many, but enough to make the mornings feel less hollow. Thomas stood by the mailbox, a rusted tin box nailed to the gate, and opened it out of habit, expecting nothing. Inside was a small envelope, handwritten, no return address, but the script was familiar. He carried it inside and sat by the fire before opening it. Dear Thomas, I made it back to town safely. The roads cleared the next afternoon, just as you predicted. The tow company hauled my car out, but it's beyond repair. That's okay. I've started volunteering at the VA center, trying to do something that matters instead of sitting in silence. You were right. Kindness has to go somewhere or it fades away. I told one of the counselors about you, not your name, just about the man in the cabin who listened more than he spoke and handed out blankets like they were medals. Enclosed is something I thought you should have, not because it's important, but because the moment was. Photo enclosed. Clara and Thomas standing outside the cabin, the mountain looming behind them. Clara's smile is wide, genuine. Thomas isn't smiling, but his eyes are alive, bright with something unspoken. Your fire didn't just warm my hands. It gave me a reason to feel again. Clara Thomas Rayburn folded the letter with deliberate care, his weathered hands moving as if the paper held something fragile, something that might crumble under too much haste. He slipped it into the pocket of his old wool coat, the one he'd worn through decades of winters, and settled back into the creaking wooden chair. The days stretched longer now, the sun lingering over the mountain's jagged edge. Snow, once a relentless blanket, was pulling back, retreating inch by inch, exposing the earth's secrets. Gnarled roots, patches of faded grass. In the winding trail Thomas had walked alone for years, his boots the only ones to mark the path. Inside the cabin, the morning unfolded with the slow rhythm of habit. Thomas shuffled to the stove, the familiar groan of the floorboards beneath him like a quiet conversation with the house. Without thinking, he poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, one for himself, one for a presence that wasn't there. The second mug sat untouched, steam curling upward like a ghost. He froze, staring at it, a pang of something sharp and unnamed tightening his chest. Shaking his head, he turned to the small photograph of Clara Monroe, propped near the stove where the warmth could reach it. With a gentleness he rarely showed, he lifted the frame and carried it to the mantel, setting it beside his army medals, their tarnished surfaces catching the firelight. He stood there, eyes tracing her face, the lines of her smile, the weight of her gaze. Minutes passed before he moved again, carrying both mugs to the table and placing them across from each other. The empty chair stared back at him, silent but heavy with absence. The fire snapped, and it popped in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the small room. The cabin hadn't changed. The same rough-hewn walls, the same iron stove, the same worn table where he'd eaten countless meals alone. But something had shifted. The silence, once a dense and suffocating thing, felt lighter, as if it had made room for something new. Thomas sipped his champagne, the bitter heat grounding him, and glanced out the window. At the edge of the tree line, a deer stood motionless, its dark eyes meeting his through the frost-etched glass. Its breath rose in soft clouds, mingling with the crisp morning air. It didn't flinch or bolt, just held his gaze with a quiet understanding. Thomas didn't stir. He gave a single nod, a gesture of recognition, like two old souls crossing paths in the stillness. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines, no longer carrying the sharp bite of the blizzard that had swept through weeks ago. It was a softer presence now, whispering rather than howling, as if the world itself had exhaled. Inside, the cabin held a warmth that went beyond the fire's glow. It was the kind of warmth that lingered, like the memory of a hand clasped tightly in the cold, or the echo of words spoken in a moment of vulnerability. Thomas reached into his coat again, his fingers brushing the letter's worn edges. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes drawn to Clara's final words. "Your fire didn't just warm my hands, it gave me a reason to feel again." The sentence settled into him, heavy with meaning, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. He folded the letter once more, tucking it into the drawer beneath the window with a reverence reserved for sacred things. He turned his gaze back to the trees, their branches swaying faintly in the morning light. The world outside was waking, stretching towards spring, and in that moment, Thomas understood something he couldn't quite name. Sometimes, shelter wasn't just a roof over your head or a fire to keep the cold at bay. Sometimes it was the quiet act of opening your door to someone else, letting their presence fill the empty spaces you'd grown used to. Sometimes shelter worked both ways.